Before we begin tonight's journey through history, I'd like to ask something simple. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, let us know in the comments what time it is for you and where you're tuning in from. I read every comment, and it always amazes me to see this quiet little community stretched across the globe. And if you find peace in these long, sleepy stories, please remember to subscribe. It's the easiest way to support this channel and make sure you never miss the next bedtime history documentary. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let us drift back into the forgotten world of the Black Death. Asterisk, imagine the world in the early 14th century. Trade routes stretched like veins across the known earth, from the bustling ports of Genoa and Venice to the caravanserais of Central Asia. Goods moved in a rhythm that connected continents: silks, spices, precious stones, grains, timber, furs. And yet, nestled in this exchange was something invisible, something no merchant saw and no ship's captain could fully control: a flea carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It was, on the surface, an ordinary flea, clinging to the rough, coarse fur of the black rat. Nothing remarkable at first glance, but this flea, and millions like it, would soon alter the course of humanity. To understand how such a small creature could change history, you must step into the forgotten details of daily life in the Middle Ages. Rats were not unusual companions. Scurried through granaries, hid beneath wooden floors, and slipped into sacks of barley or wheat. In cities like Constantinople or Marseille, no one thought twice about rodents in the marketplace. They were simply part of life's backdrop, annoying, yes, but as ordinary as flies in summer. Fleas, too, were a constant nuisance, biting humans and animals alike, little more than an itch to scratch during the night. Few, if any, connected these tiny pests to death. The bacterium itself, Yersinia pestis, thrived in the flea's gut. When the flea fed on an infected rat, the plague bacterium multiplied until it blocked the flea's stomach. Starving, desperate, the flea bit again and again, regurgitating infected blood into its new host. If that host was another rat, the infection spread quickly among the rodent population. If it was a human, the process began in earnest: high fever, swollen lymph nodes, and a death that arrived swiftly, often within days. The life of the flea was short, but in that brevity lay an enormous power: the power to dismantle empires, silence cities, and rewrite history's rhythm. In the great Eurasian trade networks, rats and fleas traveled unnoticed. Caravans moved steadily westward along the Silk Road, their merchants concerned with silk rolls, spices, and profits. But as horses and camels rested at way stations, sacks of grain provided homes for rodents. Fleas, imperceptible passengers, hopped onto new hosts. The disease spread, not with a roar, but with a whisper, carried along the same routes that had once symbolized connection and prosperity. Ships, too, became vessels not only of commerce, but of contagion. Rats thrived in the holds of galleys and cogs, their fleas multiplying in the dark, warm spaces beneath deck planks. For people of the 14th century, there was no sense that something unseen stalked their lives. Their world was shaped by the rhythms of agriculture, the cycle of feast days, and the occasional terror of famine or war. But plague was different. Unlike hunger, which crept slowly, or armies whose banners were visible on the horizon, this enemy arrived invisibly. One day, the village baker might rise to knead dough. The next, he would collapse with chills and swellings. In the narrow lanes of medieval towns, where refuse piled high and sewage ran in open drains, the conditions favored rats and their fleas. The perfect environment for an outbreak was already waiting. Historians trace the plague's European entry point to the Crimean port of Kaffa in the 1340s. A Genoese trading colony, it was besieged by the Mongols. According to chroniclers, when plague erupted among the Mongol forces. They hurled the corpses over the city walls, an early form of biological warfare. Whether or not this detail is accurate, what is certain is that ships leaving Kaffa carried rats, and the rats carried fleas. When these vessels docked in Sicily, Marseille, or Genoa, the plague disembarked quietly, like any other cargo. The flea, so small it could fit unnoticed in the seams of clothing, now carried with it a disaster without precedent. But pause for a moment here and consider how invisible details dictated survival. Imagine a grain sack filled in the steppe, lands transported hundreds of miles to a Mediterranean port. If that sack had been stored in a slightly cooler warehouse, perhaps fewer rats would have nested inside. If a ship had burned incense heavily in its holds to mask the smell of mildew, perhaps fleas might have been disturbed or killed. These are the kinds of insignificant seeming details that altered outcomes. History, during the Black Death, hinged on fleas hiding in shadows, moving quietly where no one looked. Daily life gave no warning of catastrophe. The village cobbler continued his work, sewing souls by the light of a tallow candle. Housewives scrubbed pots with ash and sand. Children played with wooden tops in the dirt. Hey, and all the while, fleas fed unnoticed. The first swelling spew bows peered under the arms, behind the ears, and in the groin. They were painful, red, and grotesquely swollen. Once a person fell ill, their family often had little time. Few recovered. To medieval minds, this sudden, incurable sickness seemed otherworldly. Some saw it as divine punishment, others as a result of poisoned wells or foul air. But the flea itself, the true culprit, remained unseen. Records from monasteries tell of monks dying in silence, one after another, their cloisters echoing with prayers for mercy. Chroniclers, themselves terrified, wrote of towns where whole families were found dead in their houses. It is tempting to think of these events as dramatic turning points, but they were lived as endless days of confusion. Ordinary people had little understanding of contagion. A mother might cradle her fevered child without fear of catching the illness herself, till she, too, fell sick. A merchant might bargain for fish in the market, unaware that the man beside him carried the deadly infection. The flea's work was quick and silent, and yet, amid this tragedy, the flea remained invisible in chronicles. Writers described the pestilence, the plague, the great mortality, but they did not know of the microscopic bacterium, nor of the humble flea's role. In fact, it would take centuries before science uncovered the truth. Middle Ages lived through devastation without understanding the enemy. Their world collapsed under a force they could not see. Think of the irony. Entire cities emptied, fields lay untilled, and kingdoms faltered not because of swords or fire, but because of a creature no bigger than the head of a pin. The flea that changed the world did not need recognition. Its effect was etched into mass graves, abandoned villages, and orphaned children wandering roads in search of bread. As we close this first section, consider the question: if history can be altered so completely by something as small as a flea, what other unseen forces might still shape our world, unnoticed until it is too late? Asterisk, when the plague began to take hold, the rhythm of life across Europe and Asia was disrupted in ways that are difficult for us to fully imagine today. The flea's bite was quick, but the chain reaction it set off unfolded slowly at first, and then with terrifying speed. By the early 1340s, whispers of an unfamiliar sickness circulated along the trade routes, and by mid-decade, the whispers had become cries of fear. Merchants, who had once measured their success by the weight of their cargo, now found themselves measuring survival by days without illness. The flea, in its invisible persistence, thrived in the gaps where human activity created shelter and abundance. Grain markets, so central to urban life, became silent epicenters of infection. Rats gnawed quietly in corners, fleas hopping from one to another, spreading Yersinia pestis like an unseen tide. The bacterium itself was merciless in its efficiency. Once introduced into the human bloodstream, it infiltrated the lymphatic system, inflaming nodes into agonizing swellings, those infamous buboes. The pain was sharp, often unbearable, and fever followed quickly. Some sufferers hallucinated, others lost their sense of speech or hearing before death claimed them. What is striking is how swiftly life unraveled. A man might walk to market in the morning and be dead by sundown, leaving his neighbors uncertain whether to grieve, plea, or lock themselves indoors. And yet, despite this mounting terror, the daily realities of medieval existence continued. Farmers still had to tend livestock. Shepherds guided flocks through damp fields. Millers ground grain, though often with fewer hands to turn the wheels. People clung to their routines, as if ordinary labor could shield them from extraordinary catastrophe. In village churches, bells. The flea remained unrecognized, but people sought explanations elsewhere. Some towns blamed outsiders, foreign merchants, traveling strangers, or even marginalized communities. Others turned inward, fearing that the plague was divine punishment for sin. Processions of flagellants marched barefoot through city streets, whipping themselves in hopes of drawing down mercy from the heavens. They believed suffering in their flesh might cleanse the unseen rot infecting society. But the flea paid no heed to prayer or penance. It continued its hidden work in silence. Ships, still vital for commerce, became harbingers of dread. A vessel docking in port could carry not only silks and spices, but also rats in its hold. From Marseille to Barcelona, from Pisa to London, stories circulated of ships arriving with their crews already dead, bodies left to rot in cabins while rats scurried, unbothered. Dockworkers approached such vessels with caution, but necessity often won out. Goods needed unloading. Life demanded continuation. And so, fleas moved from ship to shore, unnoticed yet lethal. For historians, the flea's role in this narrative is a reminder of how fragile human systems were in Arwen confronted with the natural world. The trade routes that symbolized wealth and interconnection also became arteries of disease. The very prosperity that allowed medieval cities to flourish created the conditions for their collapse. Towns with busy markets, dense populations, and constant movement of goods suffered the most. Rural villages, more isolated, sometimes escaped the first waves, only to face devastation later when merchants or pilgrims passed through. Consider the irony of the medieval household. Families worked hard to preserve food for winter, storing grain in bins and smoked meats in lofts. These preparations, meant to safeguard survival, also invited rats. Warm, dry spaces above kitchens became nesting grounds, and fleas multiplied there, waiting for their chance to feed. The very habits of self-preservation, carried out with diligence, gave the plague its foothold. Personal accounts, though often sparse, describe the atmosphere of confusion. In Siena, Italy, a chronicler wrote of bodies piled so high that churches could not contain them. In England, records of manorial rolls abruptly cease, entire villages disappearing from the administrative record. It was as though the flea erased not only lives, but also the written traces of those lives, blotting them out from history's page. And yet, amid this despair, resilience persisted. Families who survived learned to live with absence. Children were apprenticed earlier to fill the roles of fathers or mothers lost. Fields were tilled by fewer hands, but the work continued. Cute communities adapted to loss, even if they could not comprehend its cause. Humanity adjusted itself quietly around the devastation, building new patterns of survival in the shadow of a tiny insect. No one thought to blame. Some began to notice patterns. In households where cats were common, the rat population was thinner, and sometimes families fared better. In regions where winters were harsher, fleas became less active, and outbreaks slowed. But these observations rarely turned into widespread understanding. Instead, they remained fragments of local wisdom, whispered insights that went unrecorded. The grand chronicles spoke of wrath and sin, while the practical realities of fleas and rats remained beneath the surface of thought. The flea itself was not limited to Europe. It thrived across Asia and North Africa as well, spreading plague through caravan routes and desert outposts. Nomadic herders carried the disease unknowingly, their camels laden with goods and their camps visited by scurrying rodents at night. In the Middle East, cities like Damascus and Cairo endured waves of mortality, their mosques filled with prayers for deliverance. In China, the plague struck decades earlier, undermining dynasties and sowing unrest. This flea had no allegiance to geography, no respect for empire. It was impartial, an equal opportunity destroyer of worlds. What is fascinating is how thoroughly the flea's influence is intertwined with human decision-making. Every choice to trade, to gather, to store food, to travel created opportunities for its spread. And yet, people of the 14th century could not see this chain of cause and effect. They understood the symptoms, the grief, the sudden absence of neighbors, but not the mechanism. To them, the world itself seemed cursed. To us, centuries later, it is almost haunting to know the truth, that the fate of millions lay in the stomach of a flea. Imagine again the ordinariness of it. A merchant leaning over to tie a sack, brushing against a rat's fur, a child sitting on a doorstep where a flea lingered, farmer unloading a cart, unaware that in his trousers clung a tiny creature filled with plague. No moment seemed significant, yet in those unremarkable seconds, entire futures shifted. The flea remained hidden, but its legacy was etched visibly in mass graves, in the silence of abandoned villages, in the collapse of trade networks that once spanned continents. By the late 1340s, Europe was no longer the same. Populations shrank drastically, labor shortages altered economies, and faith in institutions faltered. And yet, still, no one knew the flea's role. For all the suffering, the enemy remained unseen. As Section 2 draws to a close, one must ask, if entire civilizations could be undone by something so small, how many other forces of equal subtlety might be shaping the present unnoticed, until they, too, bring the world to its knees? The plague did not vanish as suddenly as it appeared. Like the tides, it ebbed and flowed, striking some regions with ruthless force, sparing others for a time, and then returning again. By the late 1340s, its devastation was undeniable. Chroniclers wrote of death on a scale that felt biblical, describing villages emptied, towns silenced, and fields left fallow. Yet still, in all of these accounts, the flea itself remained invisible to human understanding. The true culprit continued its quiet work, unnoticed, unrecognized, while entire civilizations reshaped themselves around the scars it left behind. The first legacy of the flea was demographic collapse. Estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished within just a few years. In some places, the losses were even more staggering. Small villages simply ceased to exist, their names erased from the rolls of tax collectors and parish priests. The sound of the bell in the church tower fell silent, for there were no hands left to ring it. It is in these silences, rather than in dramatic records, that the flea's power can best be measured. Labor shortages followed, with fewer peasants to till the fields and fewer craftsmen to produce goods. The balance of power between lord and serf began to shift. Survivors demanded higher wages or better conditions. Some walked away from their villages entirely, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Though the flea itself had no knowledge of economics, Its bite altered the very structure of medieval society. Centuries of feudal obligation began to weaken, not through rebellion or decree, but through absence and absence created by death in cities. 2. The flea's aftermath was visible, but so many dead properties lay abandoned. Houses were reclaimed by weeds and dust. Cats and dogs roamed freely in places where humans had once bustled. But as the years passed, these same cities began to rebuild with new rhythms. Guilds reorganized, markets reopened, and survivors carved out lives in landscapes thinned of people. The flea's destruction had, paradoxically, created space for new beginnings. The cultural consequences were equally profound. Artists turned their focus to death, skeletons, and decay, motifs that had rarely dominated art before the 14th century. The famous danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged during this period, a reminder, painted on church walls, that death spared no one, neither king nor peasant. Writers, too, recorded the strange emptiness of the times, capturing the mixture of horror and endurance that defined life in plague years. And yet, despite this flood of imagery, the flea remained absent from human imagination. The true mechanism of the plague stayed hidden beneath layers of symbolism and superstition. Religious life shifted as well. Some communities turned to prayer with renewed intensity, convinced that the plague was divine punishment. Others, disillusioned by the church's inability. The flea also altered memory. For generations afterward, stories of the great mortality lingered in families, passed down through oral traditions. Children grew up hearing how entire households had vanished, how roads had been lined with corpses, how neighbors had disappeared overnight. These recollections were not just stories, they became part of Europe's cultural memory, shaping attitudes toward disease, fate, and the unpredictability of life. Even centuries later, echoes of the Black Death colored responses to new outbreaks of plague or influenza. The shadow of the flea stretched far beyond its lifespan, and yet, for all of this devastation and change, the flea itself remained hidden from understanding until much later. It was not until the late 19th century that scientists identified Yersinia pestis and traced its transmission through fleas on rats. By then, the world had transformed countless times over. The medieval villagers who prayed, fled, or blamed their neighbors never knew the truth. To them, the plague was a curse, a punishment, a mystery. To us, it is a reminder of how much power can be held in something unseen. Reflect for a moment on the ordinariness of this creature. It's a flea, so small it can be crushed between two fingers, so light it can leap many times its own height, lived its short life in pursuit of blood, sought only survival. Yet, in its simplicity, it carried the weight of history. Entire social systems buckled under its influence. Empires adjusted, economies shifted, cultures reoriented, all because of what clung to the fur of a rat scurrying through a grana ry. If the flea teaches us anything, it is that history is not always shaped by the grand and the visible. Not only kings and battles determine outcomes, but also the unseen, the overlooked, the mundane details of existence. A flea in a sack of grain, a rat aboard a ship, a bite in the darkness, these were the true agents of transformation in the mid-14th century. And so, the story of the flea that changed the world concludes not with a dramatic ending, but with an enduring reflection. The past is filled with forces we rarely consider. Forces so small they escape notice, yet so powerful they alter the course of humanity. As you lie here, listening, consider this. If a flea could reshape the medieval world, what quiet, unnoticed forces are at work in our own time-shaping futures we cannot yet see? Asterisk, the Black Death did not spread across Europe by chance. Its root was carved into the very structure of medieval life. Ships, caravans, and markets that connected distant lands in a web of commerce. The disease did not arrive as a storm out of nowhere. It rode silently on the backs of merchants' goods, hidden in sacks of grain, furs, and silks. To understand how plague became a pandemic, one must step onto the decks of ships and into the narrow alleys of medieval ports, where rats thrived in the shadows and merchants unwittingly carried death to every shore. Trade in the 14th century was the lifeblood of cities. Venice and Genoa, powerful maritime republics, grew wealthy from the constant flow of goods between East and West. Their fleets sailed from the Levant, bringing pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, and textiles into Europe. At the same time, the Silk Road brought caravans of merchants into Black Sea ports, where goods were loaded onto ships bound for Italy, France, and Spain. But alongside the luxury items came something else: rodents, nesting in straw, burrowing into cargo, gnawing holes into sacks of grain. And where there were rats, there were fleas. In 1346, during the siege of Kaffa, Genoese trading outpost in Crimea, the disease began to make its way westward. Contemporary chroniclers described a strange sickness among the Mongol armies surrounding the city. Men collapsed with fevers, swellings, and bleeding, dying within days. According to one dramatic account, Mongol commanders catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, hoping to infect their enemies. Whether this detail is literal or exaggerated, the essential truth remains. Merchants fleeing Caffre-boarded ships for Constantinople, Sicily, and Genoa, unknowingly carrying rats and fleas with them. The plague's journey into Europe had begun. For a medieval merchant, the sea was both opportunity and risk. Ships were cramped, their holds packed tightly with cargo. Grain was especially valuable, feeding cities and armies alike, but it also attracted vermin. Rats bred quickly in the warmth and darkness of the hold, chewing through planks and rope, darting between barrels. Sailors accepted their presence as normal, much as city dwellers accepted rats in their streets. They were a nuisance, but hardly a threat. Smaller still, barely noticed, fed silently on both rats and men. When the first ships of death docked in Sicily in 1347, the transformation was immediate. Townspeople who welcomed merchants into their harbors found themselves confronted not with exotic spices or fine silks, but with sudden sickness. Within days of a ship's arrival, people began to fall ill. They complained of fever, dizziness, and painful swellings. Few survived longer than a week. The city bells rang constantly, funerals following one after another. The markets emptied, and rumors spread that the ships themselves were cursed. Merchants faced a cruel paradox. Their livelihood depended on moving goods swiftly, but their very movement spread disaster. Some tried to conceal outbreaks aboard their vessels, hoping to unload cargo before word spread. Others found ports refusing entry, their ships forced to linger offshore, crews starving as sickness devoured them. Yet even then, rats leaped from mooring ropes to the docks, carrying fleas that slipped into the city unnoticed. Trade, the engine of prosperity, had become the engine of catastrophe. The economic structures of the time offered no protection. Insurance existed for goods lost at sea, but none for lives lost to disease. Contracts bound merchants to deliver cargo, and failing to do so could ruin entire families. Thus, even as the plague spread, ships continued to sail, caravans continued to travel, and markets struggled to function. Fleas and rats traveled alongside them, never bound by human laws. Daily life in port cities illustrates the scale of risk. In Marseille, dock workers unloaded grain by hand, carrying sacks on their shoulders into warehouses. Qaeda, rats followed the scent of food, slipping into storerooms where fleas multiplied rapidly. In Constantinople, the great crossroads of East and West, merchants haggled in crowded bazaars, brushing shoulders with sailors and traders from distant lands. Fleas passed from animal to man, unnoticed in the bustle. In Pisa, The narrow lanes around the docks echoed with the cries of fishmongers, baskets attracting both customers and rats. Everywhere commerce thrived. The plague crept invisibly into the fabric of daily exchange. It is worth pausing to recognize the irony. The very networks that connected Europe in prosperity also ensured its destruction. The Black Death did not spread randomly. It followed predictable lines of trade. Where merchants went, plague followed. The faster and more successful the commerce, the swifter the disease arrived. For ordinary people, the ships of death carried confusion. A vessel arriving from abroad was both a symbol of wealth and of threat. Town officials often rushed to collect taxes and fees from incoming goods, only to watch their own communities fall ill days later. Some tried to institute measures, quarantines of ships, restrictions on foreign traders, but these were often too late. The disease moved faster than human regulation, and yet, through all of this, the true cause remained misunderstood. People blamed the bad air of ports, the corruption of winds, or even celestial alignments. Few imagined that rats in the holds of ships and fleas in their fur carried the invisible enemy. Medieval medicine lacked the tools to perceive microbes, so explanations leaned toward the mystical or the moral. The merchant ship, seen by all, became a symbol of contagion, but the flea remained unseen. The first ships of death rewrote the map of fear. Ports once celebrated as gateways to the world became associated with danger. Cities that thrived on maritime trade faced devastation not from naval battles or piracy, but from the quiet arrival of infested vessels. Rats, scurrying ashore at night, carried fleas into granaries, markets, and homes. The disease spread inward from the harbors, reaching towns and villages far from the sea by the winter of 1347. Europe had begun to realize that something unprecedented was unfolding. The plague spread was relentless, and each new ship carried not just goods, but the potential for ruin. Merchants, once symbols of connection, became harbingers of fear. The very lifeblood of medieval civilization, the flow of commerce had turned against it. And so, as we close this first section of Story 2, consider the unsettling truth. The plague did not need an army to conquer Europe. It needed only ships, merchants, rats, and fleas. The question lingers: if trade brought both prosperity and destruction, what price do societies pay for the invisible risks hidden within their own success? The arrival of plague ships across the Mediterranean in 1347 and 1348 reshaped not only ports, but the entire rhythm of trade. Each vessel that entered a harbor carried within it the possibility of devastation. The plague spread was not random, it was mapped onto the very arteries of commerce that linked distant kingdoms. To trace the progress of the Black Death is to follow the trail of merchants and their ships. Imagine Genoa, one of the proudest maritime republics of the age. Its harbor bustled with activity. Sailors unloading barrels of oil and wine, dock workers rolling bales of wool, merchants counting coins at long wooden tables. The city's wealth had been built on centuries of trade dominance, its fleets stretching from the Black Sea to North Africa. But in 1347, A single ship docking in Genoa could alter the fate of thousands. Rats darted from gangplanks into the warehouses, fleas clinging silently to their fur. By the time authorities recognized that sickness followed in the ship's wake, the damage was already done. Venice, too, was vulnerable. Rising out of the lagoon, the city's narrow alleys and tightly packed houses made it a place where contagion spread rapidly. The Republic prided itself on careful record-keeping and regulation, yet even its officials struggled to contain the new threat. The first responses were practical, burning the belongings of the sick, cleaning canals, and attempting to control ships entering port. But merchants resisted, for trade was their livelihood, and halting commerce risked ruin. Fleas, of course, did not pause to negotiate. They traveled in silence, slipping from ship to shore, regardless of laws or decrees. Further west, in Marseille, the impact was catastrophic. A ship from the eastern Mediterranean arrived in 1347, and within days, illness spread through the port. Chroniclers describe corpses piling so quickly that cemeteries overflowed. Gravediggers themselves perished, leaving bodies unburied. Merchants who had once brought prosperity now brought fear, and yet trade could not simply stop. Marseille's position as a hub meant that even as plague tore through its streets, new ships continued to arrive, ensuring the diseases spread further into France and Spain. The paradox of the merchant's role was stark. They were both essential and dangerous, needed for food, goods, and news, yet also vectors of contagion. Authorities faced impossible choices: deny ships entry in a city, risked famine, allow them in, and the plague might spread unchecked. Many cities attempted compromises, instituting early forms of quarantine. Ships suspected of carrying disease were ordered to wait offshore, sometimes for weeks, before unloading cargo. Yet even then, rats could swim, and fleas needed only a single opportunity to move ashore. Quarantine was a fragile shield against an enemy that few understood. Beyond the Mediterranean, plague spread inland through river trade, the Rhine and Seine in France, the Thames in England, and countless smaller waterways carried goods deep into the continent. Barges floated silently upstream, their cargoes feeding cities and towns, but also carrying stowaway rodents. Rats found homes and sacks of grain and piles of timber. Alongside the bargemen and traders, fleas spread relentlessly into new regions. Villages that had never seen the sea still suffered as if the plague had marched straight through their streets. Markets became centers of risk. Weekly gatherings where farmers and merchants exchanged goods drew people together from miles around. In these crowded spaces, a single infected individual or even a flea hopping from animal to human could ignite a wave of sickness. The very design of medieval markets, with stalls tightly packed and goods laid openly on wooden tables, favored the spread of contagion. Grain spilled onto the ground, attracting rats, while the press of human bodies provided new hosts for fleas. What had once been symbols of community and sustenance became places of dread. The economic consequences grew severe. Merchants who survived found themselves facing both opportunity and ruin. With so many competitors dead, some profited enormously, buying goods cheaply and selling them at high prices to desperate buyers. Others saw their fortunes collapse as trade routes fell silent, caravans stopped, and ports shut their gates. For ordinary laborers, scarcity meant hunger, even as ships laden with food sat anchored offshore, forbidden to dock for fear of infection. Fleas knew nothing of markets, yet their presence tilted the balance of wealth and poverty across Europe. One overlooked detail of maritime life highlights how easily the flea spread. Ships of the 14th century lacked separate sleeping quarters for most sailors. Crews often slept directly in the cargo hold, lying atop sacks of grain or rope. Rats thrived in these same spaces, and fleas moved easily between rat and man. By the time sailors reached port, many carried fleas in their clothing and bedding. Even if rats were killed, the fleas had already leapt to new hosts. Ports that believed themselves secured by inspecting cargo could not account for the tiny parasites, clinging invisibly to human skin. The psychological impact of the first plague ships was immense. Communities that had once welcomed merchants with celebration now feared them. Bells that had rung in greeting fell silent, replaced by the tolling of funerals. Rumors circulated of entire ships found adrift, their crews dead, their cargo rotting. Whether true or exaggerated, such stories fed a growing sense of dread. The sea itself began to seem cursed, its bounty inseparable from death. Meanwhile, inland trade continued to fuel the spread. Caravans carrying wool, salt, and wine linked ports with distant towns. Donkeys and mules carried goods along narrow roads, their panniers laden with supplies. Rats scurried within the packs, fleas biting animals and drivers alike. No guard could detect such threats. Disease traveled at the same pace as commerce, step by step, mile by mile, woven into the very fabric of daily life. By 1348, the pattern was clear. Every major trading city in Europe faced outbreak. From Barcelona to Florence, from London to Cologne, the story repeated itself. Ships arrived, rats disembarked, fleas spread, and within weeks, the city was overwhelmed. Chroniclers tried to make sense of it. Some described poisoned wells. Others spoke of foul winds carried from the east. Few suspected that the lowly flea was the true conqueror. Merchants, meanwhile, continued their work, caught between necessity and terror, unable to halt the system that sustained them. It is striking to reflect on how invisible the mechanics of this spread were. To medieval eyes, the plague appeared as a punishment descending from heaven, or as a corruption of the air. To us, with hindsight, the story is one of small creatures thriving in the shadows of human ambition. Ships and markets were human achievements, connecting the world in unprecedented ways. Yet the flea, in its blind persistence, exploited these achievements to devastating effect. As Section 2 closes, a haunting question emerges. If commerce carried both prosperity and plague in the 14th century, how can we ever separate the benefits of human connection from the hidden dangers that travel alongside them? Asterisk, by 1348, Europe was no longer a collection of distant ports and isolated markets. It was a continent wrapped in the shadow of plague, connected by the very trade networks that had once been its pride. Every ship, every caravan, every merchant represented a potential spark in the firestorm. To understand the plague's full arrival, one must follow the journeys of these ships of death, not in dramatic naval battles or storms at sea, but in the quiet routine of commerce that turned lethal. Take, for instance, the ships that docked at Pisa. Chroniclers recorded that when the vessels came into harbor, sailors stumbled ashore already coughing, with swellings under their arms. Within days, the sickness spread into the narrow streets. The sound of commerce, the creak of cartwheels, the clinking of coins fell, silent as families locked themselves indoors. Grain ships, which should have symbolized abundance, were treated with suspicion. Dock workers, sometimes, refused to unload them, fearful that handling the cargo would bring death. Yet hunger eventually forced their hands, and with each sack lifted, the rats and fleas moved closer into the city. Florence, too, fell victim through its trade connections. A city famous for its bankers and cloth merchants, Florence had ties. 2 ports across the Mediterranean. In 1348, ships brought not only fine fabrics, but also the invisible threat of plague. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through those years, wrote of the city's devastation. Families abandoning their sick, friends refusing to bury friends, corpses lying in the streets. His words survive as one of the most haunting accounts of the Black Death. Yet, even in his detailed descriptions, the role of rats and fleas remains absent. To those living through it, the ship was the visible cause, but the true agent remained hidden. Asterisk. London, further north, received the plague later, but the pattern was the same. The Thames, alive with barges and trading vessels, carried both goods and contagion into the heart of the city. Merchants who had once brought prosperity from Bruges, Calais, and Bordeaux now carried fear. The markets around Cheapside, usually crowded with buyers, grew quieter as news spread of sudden deaths. City officials attempted regulations, burning refuse, restricting gatherings, but these measures barely slowed the spread. Once the fleas had found new hosts, the infection raced ahead. What is striking about these accounts is how ordinary the process was. The ships were not unusual, okay? They were the same vessels that had docked for decades. The merchants were not villains. They pursued their livelihoods as they always had. The rats were ever present. No one thought to exterminate them. The fleas were invisible. And yet, in this combination of routine elements, catastrophe unfolded. The Black Death did not require extraordinary circumstances only. The ordinary functioning of medieval commerce. The social fabric frayed quickly. Merchants who had once been welcomed into cities now faced suspicion and hostility. In some places, foreign traders were attacked or expelled, blamed for bringing the disease. Yet, local merchants fared no better, for the plague showed no distinction between outsider and insider. Trust in commerce eroded. A handshake, once a symbol of agreement, now carried unseen danger. Goods from afar, once celebrated, were now seen as carriers of corruption. Still, trade did not cease entirely. Ships continued to sail. Caravans continued to move, for life demanded it. Grain had to reach hungry mouths. Salt had to preserve meat. Wool had to supply weavers. The world could not stop, even as death moved along its pathways. Merchants themselves became symbols of endurance, risking their lives to maintain the flow of goods, even as their families suffered loss. The flea exploited this resilience, feeding on the necessity of human connection. Quarantine measures began to develop more systematically in response to these crises. In Venice, officials ordered ships to wait before docking, sometimes for 40 days, a period that gave us the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni. These measures were inconsistent and imperfect, but they represent one of the first attempts at organized public health policy in Europe. Even then, however, the flea was often one step ahead. Rats leaped from ships anchored offshore. Fleas clung to sailors who were allowed onto land. The measures slowed the spread, but never fully stopped it. The memory of the first ships of death endured long after the plague's initial wave. In many port cities, stories were told of vessels arriving with entire crews dead, their sails ragged, their cargo untouched. Some of these accounts may be exaggerated, but they reflect a real fear. The sea itself had become a conduit of death. Where once it symbolized adventure and wealth, it now seemed ominous, unpredictable, and cursed. And yet, hidden within this devastation were the seeds of transformation. The disruption of trade forced cities to rethink their dependence on distant markets. Local production gained importance, and some regions experimented with new agricultural practices. Survivors found new opportunities as land and wealth changed hands rapidly in the wake of so much mortality. The flea, unknowing, had altered the trajectory not only of lives but of economies. Culturally, the plague ships became symbols in art and story. Chronicles painted vivid pictures of cursed vessels drifting from port to port. Plays and sermons used them as warnings about the dangers of sin, foreignness, or greed. The ship of death entered European imagination, not just as a historical, memory, but as a metaphor for unseen danger carried in familiar forms. By the early 1350s, the first wave of the Black Death began to subside. Ships still sailed, merchants still traded, and life slowly resumed. But the memory of those years lingered. Every time a vessel entered a harbor thereafter, some must have wondered, what travels with it unseen? What danger lies hidden in its hold? The fleet's role remained invisible, but its legacy was etched into the psyche of an entire continent. The story of merchants, hands, and ships is not one of intentional harm. No merchant sought to spread plague. No sailor set out to carry death across the sea. It was the ordinary functioning of life's commerce exchange, travel, that gave the fleet its power. In this lies the unsettling lesson. Sometimes, the gravest dangers arise not from malice or design. That accompany us in our most ordinary routines. As this section in this story comes to a close, one reflection remains. If the world of the 14th century could be reshaped so completely by the hidden dangers of trade, how might our own interconnected systems carry risks we have yet to see? What ships of death, invisible for now, sail silently among us? The monastery in medieval Europe was meant to be a refuge. Behind its stone walls, monks sought to withdraw from the distractions of the world, dedicating their lives to prayer, study, and labor. Too many, the cloister represented safety and ordered rhythm of chants and bells, of bread baked and herbs gathered, of scripture copied with patient hands. Yet, when the Black Death arrived, these sanctuaries of silence became places of devastation. Disease moved quietly through the cloisters, striking down communities that had lived for centuries in seclusion. The very stillness of the monastery made the plagues spread all the more haunting. Monastic life in the 14th century followed a strict rhythm. The bell rang at dawn for matins and again for lauds, calling brothers to their daily prayers. Between services, monks tended gardens, cared for livestock, brewed ale, and copied manuscripts. Silence was prized, broken only by chant or necessity. Meals were eaten in quiet refectories, where readings from scripture accompanied the simple fare of bread, beans, and fish. Dormitories held rows of narrow beds, straw-stuffed mattresses aligned beneath the watchful eyes of carved crucifixes. To those outside, the monastery was a world aparted, peaceful, perhaps even protected by the piety of its inhabitants. But the monastery was also deeply connected to the outside world. Pilgrims came seeking blessings, alms, or shelter. Merchants delivered food, parchment, candles, and tools. Peasants worked monastery lands, paying rent in crops and labor, and monks themselves traveled, sometimes to other abbeys, sometimes to church councils or distant parishes. Rats moved as easily as men through these networks, scurrying along walls, nesting in storerooms, feeding on grain set aside for winter. Fleas traveled with them, unnoticed, waiting in shadows and straw. When the plague entered a monastery, it did so without spectacle. A brother might complain of a headache during morning prayers, then collapse by evening. Another might wake with painful swellings beneath the arms. In communities where men ate, prayed, and slept together, the infection spread quickly. The vow of care for the sick ensured that monks tended their brothers until the end, washing faces, offering water, reading psalms at the bedside. In doing so, they exposed themselves unknowingly. One by one, the community fell silent. Records from the period show the devastating toll. In some abbeys, half the monks perished in a single season. Others lost nearly all of their members, leaving churches without clergy and lands without stewards. The Benedictine Abbey of Heiligenkreuz in Austria, for example, recorded dozens of deaths within weeks, the names written hurriedly in necrologies. In England, chronicles tell of monasteries where entire libraries were left unattended because there were no longer hands to copy manuscripts. Silence deepened into emptiness, and yet, even as death spread, the routine of prayer continued. Bells still rang at fixed hours, even if fewer voices answered. Psalms for the dead filled the air, chanted by those already fevered. Monks believed, yet monasteries also left behind valuable records. Monks were literate, and many chronicled the devastation they witnessed. Some wrote of the plague as divine punishment, others as a mystery beyond human understanding. Their accounts give us rare insight into daily experience, the fear of tending to the sick, the sorrow of burying brothers, the disorientation of empty cloisters. These writings, often preserved in libraries that survived long after their authors, allow us to glimpse the human side of a disaster otherwise measured only in numbers beyond the walls. Villagers saw the monasteries decline with alarm. For centuries, monks had provided spiritual leadership, administered sacraments, and offered charity. When plague reduced their numbers, entire regions were left without guidance. Fields once managed by abbeys went untended, rents went uncollected, and alms for the poor disappeared. Communities that had depended on the monastery found themselves adrift. The flea's silent work undermined not only the monks' lives, but also the fragile social fabric woven around them. Still, resilience appeared even in these dark years. Surviving monks reorganized their communities, sometimes merging abbeys or inviting new novices to replace the dead. Some monasteries relaxed their strict rules to accept younger or less educated recruits, ensuring continuity. In time, this reshaped monastic culture, infusing it with new energy, but also diluting old traditions. The flea had not only reduced numbers, but altered the very identity of monastic life. One of the most haunting images of this period is that of mass burials within abbey grounds. Cemeteries, once orderly with neat rows of stone crosses, became crowded pits hastily filled. Monks who had spent their lives copying scripture with patience were themselves consigned to anonymous graves. The dignity of monastic death, the careful rituals, the solemn chants gave way to urgency. Survival required speed, and reverence was lost to necessity. And yet, even in this, the silence of the monastery carried meaning. To read the chronicles of those who lived through it is to sense both despair and calm acceptance. They saw themselves as part of a divine plan, their suffering meaningful in ways beyond comprehension. From our perspective, we see instead the relentless work of the flea, indifferent to prayer, indifferent to vows, different to centuries of tradition. As section 1 closes, the unresolved thought lingers: if even the monasteries, the very sanctuaries of prayer and silence, could not resist the spread of plague, then what hope did the wider world have of escape? Asterisk, when plague entered a monastery, it did not discriminate between prior, novice, or abbot. The careful hierarchy that ordered monastic life meant little in the face of a disease that struck all with equal force. The silence that had once been cultivated as a spiritual discipline became, during those years, the silence of absence. Fewer voices chanting, fewer feet shuffling along cloisters, fewer hands to tend the gardens and livestock. The rhythm of prayer continued, but with fewer participants. The sound was thinner, more fragile, like a thread stretched close to breaking. Monks lived close together, their lives shared in ways designed for communal strength, but tragically suited for contagion. The dormitory, long and narrow, often held rows of beds separated only by wooden partitions, if at all. A flea in one man's bedding could, by morning, find another host only a few feet away. Infirmaries, designed to provide care for the sick, became overwhelmed. Brothers assigned to minister to the ill often succumbed themselves within days, their devotion becoming their undoing. The very compassion that defined monastic duty opened the door to death's swift spread. Food, too, became a problem. Monasteries were not isolated in their self-sufficiency. They relied on trade for many supplies. Grain, salt, oil, and parchment arrived by cart or boat, delivered by merchants and laborers who moved between towns and abbeys. These deliveries brought not only provisions, but also rodents which slipped into granaries and kitchens. In a world without pest control as we know it, rats thrived on the scraps and stores of monastic life. Fleas, feeding on them, found abundant opportunities to leap onto human hosts. The sacred walls offered no true defense. Some monasteries attempted to isolate themselves. Gates were closed, visitors denied, and contact with the outside world minimized. Yet complete separation was nearly impossible. Monks needed food, parchment, candles, and tools. Even the smallest opening and exchange at the gate, a delivery, left at the door, was enough. And once the plague entered, the close-knit community provided no refuge. In fact, the isolation that once gave monasteries their character now worked against them, turning them into enclosed chambers where the disease could move unimpeded. The psychological toll was immense. For men who had devoted their lives to prayer, the plague presented a challenge not only to their bodies, but to their faith. Why would God strike his servants so mercilessly? Was their devotion insufficient? Did the silence of the cloister mask hidden sins? Some chroniclers wrote of despair among the monks, questioning the very meaning of their vows. Others doubled down on devotion, interpreting the plague as a test, purifying fire through which only the faithful would endure. Between despair and defiance, the monastery's walls echoed with prayers. There were also cries of confusion. Daily duties became heavy burdens. The bell still rang, but fewer came to answer it. Fields needed tending, but hands were scarce. Scriptorium, once alive with the scratching of pens on parchment, fell quiet as scribes succumbed to illness. Candles burned in refectories where half the benches were empty. Silence grew not as a discipline, but as an unavoidable reality. Some abbeys, novices as young as 12, were tasked with duties once carried out by senior brothers, thrust suddenly into roles of responsibility they were unprepared for. The impact reached beyond the walls. Monasteries were centers of learning and record keeping. And when monks died, archives and libraries sometimes fell into neglect. Manuscripts went unfinished. Annals stopped mid-sentence. Whole centuries of accumulated wisdom teetered on the brink of loss because fleas had crept into the dormitory straw. For historians today, these silences in the records speak loudly of devastation. The communities surrounding monasteries suffered too. Villagers often relied on monks for medical care drawn from herbal knowledge, for charity in times of famine, for the sacraments that marked life's passages. When plague emptied abbeys, these services vanished. A child might be born without baptism. A dying man might receive no last rites. A widow might find the abbey gates shut when she came for bread. The collapse of monastic care rippled outward, leaving entire regions spiritually and practically adrift. Yet resilience appeared in unexpected forms. Surviving monks sometimes sought help from lay brothers, villagers, or even women roles that had once been carefully restricted, now blurred out of necessity. Lay workers were invited into abbey fields. Parish priests stepped in to perform duties once reserved for monks. In some cases, hermits or wandering preachers gained influence, filling gaps left by weakened monasteries. The order of medieval religion bent, adapted, reshaped itself around the absences created by the flea. Some monasteries recorded extraordinary mortality. In England, the Cistercian Abbey of Meaux lost so many monks that the abbot himself lamented the near extinction of his community. At Montmajour in Provence, an abbey with centuries of history, chroniclers wrote of death upon death until only a fraction remained. These were not isolated tragedies, but widespread patterns repeated across Europe. The cloister, once imagined as impregnable, revealed its vulnerability, and yet, even in their decline, monasteries bore witness. Surviving chroniclers wrote in detail of the burial of brothers, the endless tolling of bells, the exhaustion of those left alive. They saw themselves as scribes of catastrophe, preserving not only their faith, but the record of their suffering. These writings remind us that history is not only made of kings and battles, but also of anonymous monks in silent cloisters, their lives undone by a creature smaller than the eye could clearly see. As Section 2 draws to a close, the question arises: if the monasteries' repositories of knowledge, faith, and discipline could be brought so low by the unseen bite of a flea, how many other pillars of society stood vulnerable, waiting unknowingly for collapse? The silence that fell over monasteries during the Black Death was not only the silence of prayer, but the silence of loss. As the months wore on, communities that had thrived for centuries dwindled into shadows of their former selves. Cloisters that once echoed with chants became corridors of emptiness. Libraries, once alive with the scratch of quills, stood still. The plague did not merely take lives, dismantled centuries of rhythm, order, and tradition. One of the clearest legacies was the weakening of monastic authority. For generations, monasteries had been anchors of stability. Landowners, educators, healers, and spiritual leaders. The plague disrupted this balance. In many abbeys, whole generations of experienced monks perished, leaving only novices or lay brothers to carry on. Some abbeys collapsed entirely, their lands absorbed by neighboring estates or left to decay. Others limped on, but their character changed. With so many trained scribes dead, the careful preservation of texts faltered. Some manuscripts were abandoned mid-page, the ink drying where the hand had fallen. To modern readers, these unfinished lines are silent testimonies of sudden death. Economically, monasteries faced enormous strain. With fewer monks to work fields or manage tenants, income dropped. Abbey lands, once meticulously cultivated, grew over with weeds. Grain rotted in abandoned granaries. Vineyards were left untended. Fish ponds stagnated. Many abbeys resorted to leasing lands to lay tenants or selling off properties altogether. The plague forced institutions built for permanence into improvisation. Monasteries that had endured wars, famines, and political upheavals now bent under the pressure of a flea's relentless march. Yet, even in this devastation, resilience showed itself. Surviving monks adapted. Some monasteries welcomed recruits who would once have been rejected men, too young, poorly educated, or from humbler backgrounds. Strict requirements of earlier centuries gave way to pragmatism. This influx altered the character of monastic life, introducing fresh perspectives, but also diluting older traditions. The monastic culture of Europe after the plague was not the same as it had been before. The flea had reshaped not only numbers, but identity. Spiritually, the plague deepened both faith and doubt. Some monks saw their survival as a sign of divine favor, redoubling their devotion. Others wrestled with despair, questioning why God had allowed his servants to die in such numbers. Was their chanting in vain? Were their vows insufficient? These questions, preserved in chronicles and letters, reflect the deep spiritual wounds left by the epidemic in the silence of their cloisters. Monks struggled with the same questions that haunted peasants, nobles, and kings. The plague also altered the relationship between monasteries and surrounding communities. Where once abbeys had provided charity, education, and care, their weakened state left gaps. Local priests, lay people, and even new religious movements stepped in to fill the void. The balance of religious authority shifted subtly but profoundly. The church remained powerful, but the unquestioned dominance of monasteries faded. The flea, without intention, had altered the spiritual map of Europe. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the cemeteries. Abbey grounds became crowded with hurried burials. Graves, once carefully dug and marked, turned into mass pits. Monks, who had spent their lives in discipline and devotion, were lowered into the earth without ceremony, their names sometimes unrecorded. The bells tolled, but the rituals were abbreviated, compressed by necessity. The silence of prayer was replaced by the silence of earth, and yet, in surviving records, there is a quiet dignity. Chroniclers did not exaggerate with drama, but noted the facts. Here, many brothers died. Here, the plague took its toll. These simple lines, written by trembling hands, carry more weight than any sermon. They remind us that the Black Death was not only a catastrophe of numbers, but a tapestry of individual livesmen who rose at dawn to pray, who copied psalms by candlelight, who tended gardens in silence so the flea ended their routine. The story of monasteries in the Black Death is, in the end, a story of fragility and endurance. Fragility, because centuries of stability could be undone in a matter of weeks. Endurance, because even in the face of near extinction, some abbeys survived, adapted, and rebuilt. The silence that once seemed final gave way, in time, to new voices. Bells rang again. Manuscripts were copied anew. Novices filled empty cells. The monastery was changed, but not erased. Reflect, then, on this paradox. Monasteries had sought to remove themselves from the world, to live apart in silence and prayer. Yet the world, in the form of a flea, entered their walls and reshaped them forever. The lesson is as clear now as it was invisible then. No wall, however high, can fully protect against the unseen forces that move silently through history. And so, Story 3 concludes. A question remains: if even the most secluded sanctuaries could not resist the silent spread of plague, where, truly, can any society find refuge from the forces it does not yet understand? Asterisk, by the time the plague reached London in the autumn of 1348, the city was already a crowded, fragile place. Narrow streets wound between timber-framed houses, their upper stories leaning inward until they nearly touched. Open drains ran along the lanes, carrying refuse from homes and workshops toward the Thames. The air carried the smells of tanneries, butchers, stalls, and smoke from countless hearths. London was a city alive with trade, prayer, noise, and human proximity. It was exactly the kind of environment where plague could thrive. London was not only England's largest city, but also its beating commercial heart. Ships filled with wool, wine, salt fish, and spices docked at Billingsgate and Queenhithe. Cotters trundled goods into Cheapside, where stalls sold bread, ale, cloth, and meat. The Guildhall bustled with business, while St. Paul's Cathedral drew pilgrims, clergy, and scholars. How woven into this energy was vulnerability. Rats found abundant food in granaries and warehouses. Fleas multiplied in straw strewn across market stalls. The very prosperity of London ensured its downfall when plague finally arrived. The first signs were small. Chroniclers describe sailors falling sick in port, their fevers rising suddenly, their bodies covered with swellings. Soon, dock workers and their families followed. In a city of nearly 80,000, sickness spread quickly. The wealthy fled, if they could, seeking refuge in country estates. But most Londoners had nowhere to go. They lived close together, often with multiple families under a single roof. Once the plague entered a household, it rarely spared anyone inside. Death overwhelmed the city. Cemeteries that had sufficed for generations suddenly filled to capacity. The parish graveyards of St. Mary's Spital, St. Bride's, and St. Dunstan's could not keep up with the daily influx of corpses. Bodies were laid in rows, one atop another, in pits hastily dug and hastily filled. Priests, themselves dying, struggled to perform rites. Bells tolled constantly, so much so that chroniclers later described London as if it were one unending funeral procession. The authorities tried to respond. In January 1349, the city opened a new burial ground on land purchased at Smithfield. It was called East Smithfield Cemetery, and it became one of the largest plague cemeteries in Europe. Archaeological excavations in recent decades have revealed mass graves dug with grim efficiency. Long trenches where bodies were laid shoulder to shoulder, sometimes wrapped in shrouds, sometimes not. The soil still carries traces of quicklime, sprinkled in hopes of containing the stench and the disease. Thousands were buried there within months. Daily life collapsed into the rhythm of death. Carters drove through the streets, calling for families to bring out their dead. Corpses were loaded onto carts, sometimes piled so high the limbs hung over the sides. These grim processions moved slowly toward cemeteries, bells marking their passage. For those still alive, the sight became routine. Children, once accustomed to games and alleys, grew used to the sound of wheels creaking under the weight of bodies. The city itself became one long funeral, and yet, amid this devastation, ordinary details persisted. Bakers still rose before dawn to knead bread, even if fewer customers came. Alewives still brewed beer, though their benches were emptier. A merchant might still haggle over cloth in Cheapside, though with an eye on the neighbor coughing nearby. London did not stop. It staggered. Survival meant continuing routine even when surrounded by death. The flea fed invisibly, while the city clung to the motions of daily life. The psychological toll was immense. Many Londoners saw the plague as divine punishment. Some joined flagellant processions, though these were less common in England than on the continent. Others turned inward, seeking solace in prayer or in desperate remedies. Physicians prescribed fumigations, bleeding, and charms. Some households lit constant fires to purify the air. Others carried posies of herbs, hoping their fragrance would repel corruption. None of it mattered. The flea, unseen and unrecognized, moved easily through markets, homes, and churches. The clergy suffered especially. Priests were called upon to administer last rites, but many fell ill themselves. Monasteries in and around London lost entire communities. Parish churches, once filled with chants, grew quiet. And yet, as with all great calamities, life continued in altered forms. Survivors married quickly, widows finding new husbands within weeks. Apprentices inherited their masters' shops. Children, suddenly orphaned, became wards of neighbors or the church. London adapted, reshaping itself around the gaps left by the plague. The city endured, but its memory was scarred. What makes London's story unique is the scale of documentation. Chronicles, court records, wills, and burial lists survive in greater numbers than for many other cities. These allow us to glimpse the human side of catastrophe. A tailor leaving his tools to his apprentice. A widow bequeathing her bed and linens to her daughter. A priest recording the deaths of his entire parish within weeks. The city's grief is preserved in ink, etched as deeply into history as the pits at Smithfield were etched into earth as Section 1 closes. The image of London remains one of constant mourning, our city, where every street echoed with carts for the dead, where bells tolled without pause, where ordinary life persisted in fragments amid loss. The unresolved question lingers: if London itself, the greatest city of England, rich in trade and faith, could become one long funeral, what hope did smaller towns and villages have of resisting the same fate? By the winter of 1348 into the spring of 1349, London's crisis deepened. The plague no longer lingered just at the docks or in crowded parishes near the river. It had spread everywhere, into guild halls, markets, taverns, and even the homes of the wealthy who thought themselves safe behind strong doors. No neighborhood was spared. The city, which had been a place of commerce and celebration, now felt like a graveyard stretching from the Tower to Westminster. The rhythm of London's funeral was unrelenting. Carters known as death-bearers moved from parish to parish. Their carts painted with rough symbols of mortality. They shouted through the lanes, warning households to bring out their dead. Families placed bodies on doorsteps, wrapped in linen if possible, or simply covered with a cloak. The carters stacked them one atop another until the cart creaked under the weight. Bells tolled to mark their departure, but as more carts rolled, the sound became constant, indistinguishable, like the hum of an endless dirge. London's parishes strained under the pressure. Each parish normally buried its own dead, but during the plague, this custom collapsed. Cemeteries filled faster than graves could be dug. Clergy, gravediggers, and sextons fell ill, leaving no one to perform duties. In some places, neighbors dug pits themselves, lowering bodies hurriedly, with few prayers said. Smithfield Cemetery became a central solution, but even there, the scale was staggering. Trenches were dug deep and wide, with layers of bodies separated by soil and lime. Archaeological evidence today shows clear signs of this grim efficiency: long pits where hundreds were interred at once. Their arms sometimes intertwined, as if even in death they were bound together. For ordinary Londoners, grief was compounded by fear. Families often buried multiple members within days. A child might carry his mother to the door one morning, only to be carried out himself by evening. Some households were entirely extinguished, their homes left locked and silent, possessions abandoned, in wills and testaments from 1349. There is a recurring sense of urgency. Property passed quickly to heirs. Apprentices inherited shops, and neighbors assumed responsibilities. Life itself seemed fragile, provisional, ready to vanish at any moment. Yet London continued to function in fragments. Guilds, though diminished, still regulated trades. Markets reopened when possible, though with fewer stalls. Bakers continued their work, even as flour grew scarce. Alewives brewed beer in smaller batches. Cities staggered forward, not in defiance, but in necessity. Hunger was as dangerous as plague. Without bread and ale, survival was impossible. Commerce slowed, but did not cease, and with every reopening of a stall or workshop, the flea had new opportunities to spread. The church faced immense strain. Priests were in constant demand for last rites, funerals, and confessions. Many died in the process, and replacements were hastily ordained, sometimes with little training. Chroniclers record that men barely out of boyhood were made priests overnight, tasked with ministering to communities in crisis. Faith endured, but its institutions faltered. The sheer weight of death exposed the vulnerability of the church's hierarchy. For some, this was proof of divine wrath. For others, it was evidence that the church was not the unshakable rock it had seemed to be. Law and order were also challenged. The courts of London saw their roles interrupted by mortality. Trials were postponed, cases abandoned. Property disputes became complicated when entire families died with no heirs. Vacant houses invited looting. The sheriff and aldermen attempted to maintain stability, but their own ranks were thinned by illness. Authority itself felt provisional, a fragile shell over a city consumed by mortality. One overlooked detail of London's funeral was the soundscape. Chroniclers note the constant tolling of bells. But there were other sounds too: the creak of carts on cobblestones, the murmur of funeral prayers, the clatter of spades digging hurriedly in cemeteries. There were also silences: markets that once rang with noise, now subdued; taverns once filled with laughter, now quiet. To live in London during those months was to inhabit a city where every sound carried death's echo. The wealthy sought escape. Nobles and merchants who had country estates fled, leaving their London houses shuttered. Some survived, but others carried plague with them into the countryside, spreading devastation further. Those left behind often felt abandoned. Chroniclers accused the rich of cowardice, noting how quickly they fled when danger came. Yet in truth, flight was one of the few strategies available, even if it spread the disease more widely. For the poor, escape was impossible. They lived cheek by jowl in alleys, sharing walls, roofs, and even bedding. Once plague entered these spaces, it spread with terrifying speed. In Southwark, across the Thames, inns and brothels became centers of contagion. In the city proper, tenements collapsed into silence as families died together. Poverty magnified vulnerability. The flea bit without distinction, but the conditions of the poor gave it abundant ground. The burial crisis forced innovation. Smithfield became the most famous cemetery, but others were opened in haste. Clerkenwell, Aldgate, and other districts saw pits dug on fields that had once been meadows. Some chroniclers described the landscape itself changing. Green fields transformed into burial grounds. Roadsides dotted with crosses, gardens converted into graveyards. London expanded its geography of death, reshaping its very soil to accommodate the scale of loss. Despite the scale of tragedy, evidence of resilience lingers. Survivors adapted quickly. Widows remarried, sometimes within weeks, seeking protection and stability. Apprentices became masters. Orphans were taken in by neighbors or parish funds. The social fabric frayed, but it did not fully collapse. Even amid loss, life insisted on continuing, and yet the psychological wounds endured. Chroniclers describe London as if the city itself had become a corpse, its lifeblood drained, its voice silenced. The memory of unending funerals remained long after the plague's first wave passed. Families who survived carried the trauma into the future, shaping how communities viewed sickness, strangers, and the fragility of life. As Section 2 closes, the image is of a city staggering forward under the weight of death. London endured, but it was changed forever. The unresolved thought remains: if London, with its wealth, faith, and numbers, could barely sustain itself through the funeral of 1349, what chance did smaller towns and villages have when their turn came? By the summer of 1349, London had endured nearly a year of unrelenting plague. The funeral that seemed to stretch without end was beginning to taper, but the damage had already been done. Tens of thousands lay buried in East Smithfield and countless other pits. Entire parishes were hollowed out, their rolls of taxpayers cut in half or worse. The city that once claimed to be the proudest in England now bore scars too deep to ignore. The aftermath was not silence, but a strange mixture of relief and unease. Survivors emerged from their homes into streets that felt altered, unfamiliar. Neighbors were gone, shops stood vacant, and familiar voices no longer echoed in the lanes. The tolling of bells grew less constant, but its echo lingered in memory. For those who had lived through the plague, London would never sound the same again. One of the immediate consequences was economic upheaval. With so many dead, labor grew scarce. Surviving workers demanded higher wages, citing the sheer lack of hands to do the work. Masters resisted, but necessity forced concessions. Bakers, brewers, and weavers found themselves with new bargaining power. Apprentices stepped into the roles of masters, sometimes without formal training. Markets reopened, but prices shifted unpredictably. London's long funeral had left behind not only grief, but also a restructured economy. Asterisk. The church struggled to recover. The deaths of so many priests left parishes without leadership. Placement clergy were ordained quickly, but their inexperience often showed. Faith itself was shaken. Many Londoners wondered why God had allowed his city to suffer so heavily. Some turned away from the church, while others embraced new forms of devotion, pilgrimages, relic cults, or private prayer. The sound of chant returned to London's churches, but it was thinner, less confident, carrying the memory of absence. Socially, the plague redrew boundaries. Families that had once been wealthy found themselves diminished when heirs died. Others rose unexpectedly, inheriting shops, land, or coin from relatives who had perished. Widows remarried, sometimes bringing businesses into the hands of new. Husbands, orphans, were absorbed into households or left to parish charity. The plague leveled some distinctions while sharpening others, its hand shaping society in ways no council or king could have planned. East Smithfield Cemetery, once a meadow, became a lasting monument to London's ordeal. Its pits were eventually covered, the land repurposed, but memory clung to it. Even centuries later, records referred back to that ground as a place of extraordinary mortality. Archaeological digs in recent decades have uncovered bones laid in neat rows, sometimes wrapped in fragments of cloth, sometimes bare. The care taken, even in mass burial, speaks to the determination of Londoners to preserve dignity amid collapse. Death was overwhelming, but it was not careless. And yet, beneath this dignity lay trauma. Children who grew up during those years remembered streets filled with carts of corpses. Adults who survived carried the memory of sudden loss of families, extinguished in days, of churches emptied of clergy, of neighbors disappearing overnight. This trauma shaped attitudes for generations. Plague remained a shadow over London long after 1349, returning in later waves, but never with quite the same shock. The first funeral had left its mark too deeply. What makes London's ordeal stand out in the chronicles is not only its scale, but its documentation. Wills and court rolls show the abrupt shift of property, testifying to the speed of death. Atish records captured the thinning of congregations. Chroniclers at St. Paul's and Westminster wrote of funerals so constant they blurred into one. These documents remind us that behind the statistics were lives tailors, bakers, priests, carters, children, each part of London's unending funeral. The city did endure. Trade resumed. Ships docked once more, and Cheapside filled again with merchants' cries. But something in its spirit had changed. London had confronted its own fragility, and though it survived, it could not forget. Bells rang again for weddings and baptisms, but in their sound lingered the memory of the endless toll for the dead. The lesson of London's longest funeral lies not only in its mortality, but in its resilience. The city bent, but did not break. Its people adapted, its institutions reformed, its markets revived. Yet, beneath this recovery lay a truth. No amount of wealth, faith, or power could shield a city from forces it did not understand. The flea remained invisible. Its legacy was written in every empty house and every trench of Smithfield. As this story closes, Hada, one reflection remains. If London, the heart of a kingdom, could be reduced to one long funeral by a creature unseen, what does that tell us about the fragility of human order, even in the greatest of cities? Asterix, the Black Death, is often remembered through the chronicles of great cities, London, Florence, Paris, Venice, places where records survived, where scholars and priests wrote down their impressions. But much of Europe in the 14th century did not live in cities. Most people were peasants, tied to the land, bound by obligations to lords, and clustered in small villages of timber houses, thatched roofs, and dirt lanes. When the plague reached these villages, it erased not monuments or libraries, but voices, entire communities that left little written trace of their existence. The silence of these villages is one of the most haunting aspects of the Black Death. A medieval peasant village was small, often no more than a cluster of houses around a church, a common green, and fields stretching outward in strips. Houses were built of wattle and daub, with smoke drifting through thatch rather than chimneys. Livestock shared space with families, pigs rooting in yards, chickens underfoot, cows in byres attached to dwellings. Life was communal, neighbors sharing tools, labor, and gossip. Fields were farmed collectively, plowed in long open strips with rotations of wheat, barley, oats, and legumes. The rhythm of the year was set by seasons, harvests, and the tolling of the church bell. Into this simple, fragile rhythm came the plague. Unlike cities, villages had no walls, no officials to organize burials, no chronicles to record events. When plague arrived, it moved quietly. Perhaps a traveling peddler passed through, or a pilgrim seeking lodging, or a messenger from a nearby town. A flea clinging to their clothing, a rat scurrying from their carts. Small details were enough. Within days, the first swellings appeared. A family sickened, neighbors visited, and soon the entire village was touched. For peasants, understanding was limited. Few could read or write. Explanations relied on rumor, tradition, and the pronouncements of priests. Some believed the air had been poisoned, others that sin had brought divine punishment. Fires were lit in hearths day and night to purify the air. Herbs were hung from rafters, charms worn around necks. But nothing seemed to work. Families that had survived famine and harsh winters and had endured the burdens of labor and taxation now faced an enemy they could not resist. The impact was immediate and brutal. In some villages, death came so quickly that entire households were extinguished before neighbors could help. A plow stood abandoned in the field, oxen wandering unattended. Bread dough sat unbaked on a hearth. Children cried in empty houses. Villages that had been noisy with animals, gossip, and church bells grew silent. Chroniclers in nearby towns sometimes noted this silence, describing villages left empty, without voices, without sound, without life. Burial was a challenge. Without organized clergy or enough able-bodied men, graves were dug hastily. Some families buried their own dead in gardens or fields. Others left bodies for days until survivors from neighboring villages arrived to help. In some regions, mass graves swallowed entire communities. The dignity of traditional rites, processions, prayers, holy water was often impossible. Death outpaced ritual. The economic structure of feudalism faltered here most clearly. Lords depended on peasants to work the land and pay rents. When peasants died in large numbers, fields went unplowed, rents went unpaid, and manorial records show abrupt absences. Some villages simply vanished from these records. Their names struck out, never to reappear. Archaeologists today find traces of these vanished communities, abandoned foundations, pottery shards, forgotten fields reclaimed by forest. The plague had not only killed individuals, It had erased entire settlements from the map, and yet, even in this devastation, survivors found ways to endure. In some villages, those who remained took over the land of the dead, expanding their fields and herds. Widows remarried quickly, often to neighbors who suddenly inherited larger holdings. Orphans were taken in by distant kin or lords seeking to repopulate their estates. The very structure of rural life bent and reshaped itself in response to absence. 4. Those who lived, the psychological burden was immense. Imagine walking through a village where half the houses stood empty, doors ajar, belongings abandoned. The silence itself became oppressive. Songs, laughter, the rhythm of work call, replaced by stillness. Survivors carried this memory long after the plague passed. The absence of voices became as much a marker of the Black Death as the swellings or fevers. It is here in the countryside that the true scale of the Black Death is hardest to grasp. Cities left records, but villages left silences. For every chronicled death in London or Florence, there were countless unrecorded ones in villages whose names we no longer know. The flea's legacy was not only in numbers, but in the erasure of lives that left no words behind. As Section 1 closes, one thought lingers: if entire villages could vanish without leaving records, how much of history itself has been shaped not by what was written, but by the silences left behind. Asterisk. The devastation of the Black Death in Europe's villages is difficult to measure, precisely because those who lived there rarely left written records. What we know comes indirectly through tax rolls, manorial accounts, church registers, the occasional notes of traveling chroniclers. But within those fragments lies a picture of overwhelming silence. Rural communities erased, their voices gone, their existence only hinted at in the gaps of parchment. Considered the manorial record, the rhythm of peasant life made these losses particularly harsh. Work was collective. Fields were shared, plowed in long open strips, and harvests required many hands. When half a village died, the labor system collapsed. Oxen stood idle in byres, carts rotted in sheds, and fields lay fallow. The cycle of sowing and reaping, so central to survival, faltered. Grain shortages followed, even as land lay unplanted. Villages that had endured poor harvests in the past found themselves unable to recover, not from bad weather, but from absence. The church, which held central importance in rural life, also faltered. Parish priests died in great numbers, leaving villages without spiritual leadership. Bells that had marked births, marriages, and funerals fell silent. In some places, survivors turned to wandering hermits or friars for guidance. In others, they carried out their own burials, digging shallow graves near churches or even in family fields. The absence of ritual deepened the sense of abandonment. For peasants who had believed firmly in the importance of prayer for the dead, the inability to perform proper rites was as devastating as the death itself. Life within the households that survived was transformed. Widows suddenly held land in their own right, something rare in earlier times. Children inherited property at younger ages, reshaping family structures. The social order that had kept peasants bound to lords and land began to shift, with fewer workers available, surviving. Peasants could negotiate better terms or even leave for other villages offering lighter burdens. Lords tried to enforce old obligations, but necessity favored the laborers. It is no exaggeration to say that the silence of villages gave rise to the weakening of feudalism itself. The material culture of peasants also reflects this change. Archaeological digs show houses abandoned with pottery still on shelves, grain in storage pits, tools left leaning against walls. Tight, these sudden abandonments suggest death arrived swiftly. In some cases, the land was later reclaimed by forest, covering the traces of human life, yet the objects left behind speak volumes. A child's toy carved from wood, a spindle whorl, a knife. They remind us that the plague did not strike abstract populations, but individuals living ordinary, fragile lives. The silence extended beyond the physical. Memory itself was fractured. Without written records, the stories of these lost villages were not preserved a generation later. Children growing up in neighboring settlements may not have even remembered the names of villages erased by plague. The Black Death thus reshaped not only the demographic map, but the mental landscape of Europe. Gaps in memory became as significant as gaps in population. Still, survival persisted. Some villages recovered, slowly repopulating through births or migration. Others were consolidated, with survivors moving together for mutual support. Lords sometimes encouraged new settlers by offering better terms of tenancy. Out of loss, opportunities emerged. The structure of rural life was never the same again. Peasants gained bargaining power, wages rose, and the old certainties of feudal hierarchy began to bend. The silence of some villages gave voice to new demands elsewhere. Yet, in the midst of these transformations, grief endured. Imagine a lone survivor walking through the lanes of a village once filled with laughter and gossip. Empty houses, broken fences, and overgrown gardens bore mute witness to lives cut short. The survivor might inherit land, but also the weight of absence. This psychological toll is harder to measure than rents or wages, but it is no less real. As Section 2 draws to a close, the question remains: if entire villages could vanish without leaving more than fragments in records and ruins in fields, how much of human experience lies forever lost to silence, erased not only by death, but by the absence of memory? Asterisk, the Black Death's assault on Europe's villages left consequences that lasted for generations. If London's cemeteries and Florence's chronicles give us loud testimony of the plague's toll, the countryside offers something quieter, but no less significant: absence. It is in these vanished villages that the long-term reshaping of Europe becomes clearest. Many of these communities never recovered. Archaeologists today identify them as deserted medieval villages. Their remains scattered across fields. A line of raised earth suggests where a street once ran. Stone footings of long-collapsed cottages peek through grass. Pottery shards, iron nails, fragments of roof tile lie buried just beneath the soil. These are not ruins of grand castles or cathedrals, but the faint traces of ordinary life. Their silence tells a story as powerfully as any chronicle. The economic impact of these disappearances was profound. Lords who had once relied on dozens of tenant families to work their land suddenly found their estates half empty, fields reverted to pasture, forests encroached, mills stood idle. Desperation led many lords to offer better terms to survivors: lighter rents, reduced labor services, even outright grants of freedom. Peasants, for the first time in centuries, had leverage. The scarcity of labor made their work more valuable, and they could demand conditions once unthinkable. The collapse of villages thus accelerated the decline of serfdom, shifting Europe toward a new economic order. But such gains came at immense human cost. Families that had cultivated the same fields for generations vanished. Churches that had stood at the heart of communities were abandoned, their bells falling silent, their stones scavenged for building elsewhere. Parish registers record abrupt endings, baptisms and marriages trailing off, followed by a final cluster of burials. Then nothing. A village gone, not by fire or conquest, but by silence. The psychological weight of these absences shaped culture as well. Survivors grew up with the memory of empty houses and vanished neighbors. Folktales whispered of ghost villages, cursed places where no one dared to settle. Pilgrims traveling across Europe encountered landscapes dotted with ruins, reminders of mortality more haunting than any sermon. In this way, The silence of lost villages became part of Europe's collective imagination. It's a constant background to the generations that followed. Not all was lost, however. Some villages survived and adapted. With fewer mouths to feed, survivors sometimes found themselves with better diets, more meat and dairy available, more land per person. Standards of living in some regions rose. The irony is stark. The plague that erased entire communities also, in certain cases, improved life for those left behind. Yet this improvement was always shadowed by memory, the knowledge that abundance came from absence, that prosperity rested on graves. The church struggled with the consequences as well. In parishes where priests died, replacements were scarce. Lay people sometimes performed prayers or rudimentary rites themselves. When new priests were finally installed, they were often young, hurriedly trained, lacking the authority of their predecessors. Trust in the church faltered. In time, this erosion of confidence fed into broader currents of discontent that would later shape reform movements. The silence of villages contributed, indirectly, to the questioning of institutions once thought unshakable in the broader sweep of history. These vanished villages remind us that the Black Death was not only an urban crisis, it was a rural catastrophe, striking at the very foundation of medieval society. The peasants, who formed the vast majority of Europe's population. The plague was not an event recorded in chronicles, but an erasure lived in silence. Their stories are harder to tell because they left fewer words, but their absence reshaped the future as much as any king's decree. As we walk through the remnants, today's overgrown field, a scatter of stone foundations, a hollow lane disappearing into woodland, we can sense the depth of that silence. The voices are gone, but the traces remain. A flea that carried plague did not know it was erasing communities, but the effect was the same. Villages disappeared, voices faded, and history itself grew quieter. As this story closes, one reflection lingers. If the voices of peasants could be silenced so completely that only broken pottery and faint earthworks remain, how much of human history lies not in what is remembered, but in what has been forgotten? When the Black Death swept across Europe, physicians, those charged with healing, were thrust into a storm they could neither understand nor control. In the 14th century, medicine was still bound to the teachings of ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through medieval scholasticism. The body was believed to be governed by the balance of humorous blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to arise when these humors fell into imbalance, or when the air itself became corrupted. With this framework, physicians faced the plague, not with microscopes or knowledge of bacteria, but with theory, ritual, and a desperate hope that reason might bring order to chaos. The image of the plague doctor in his long coat and bird-beaked mask has become one of history's most enduring symbols. It belongs more to the later waves of plague, especially in the 17th century. In the 14th century, physicians wore no such uniform, but their attempts to protect themselves foreshadowed what the mask would later represent. But in 1348, as the plague tore through cities, most physicians had only rudimentary defenses. Some carried posies of herbs to their noses. Others lit fires in their chambers, believing smoke could cleanse the air. A few wore waxed robes or covered themselves in protective ointments, hoping to ward off corruption. None of it mattered. The flea did not care for miasma theories. It bit through linen and leather alike, delivering death invisibly. Still, physicians tried. In Florence, doctors recorded the symptoms with careful attention: sudden fever, swollen buboes, dark blotches under the skin, spitting of blood. Their descriptions survive in chronicles, haunting in their precision. In Paris, the medical faculty gathered to issue advice to King Philip VI. Their report blamed the alignment of planets specifically, the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, and 1345s having corrupted the air. They recommended avoiding bathing, since they believed it opened the pores to poison vapors and urged the burning of aromatic woods. The advice was elaborate, logical within its framework, entirely useless. The patients who sought help found little comfort. Physicians prescribed bleeding, cupping, and purging, standard treatments for rebalancing humors. Some applied poultices of herbs to the buboes. Others lanced the swellings to let out corrupted matter. These interventions sometimes offered brief relief but rarely saved lives. Death came swiftly, often within 3 days. Families who paid dearly for medical attention often saw no improvement, fueling resentment and despair. Many physicians fled. Just as nobles abandoned cities for country estates, doctors with means often left towns in search of safety. Those who remained were sometimes motivated by duty, sometimes by desperation, sometimes by the lure of high fees. Chroniclers note that physicians could demand extraordinary payments during the plague, for the risk of their work was immense. Yet, even the wealthiest patients often found that no sum could purchase survival. The absence of effective treatment led to improvisation. In some towns, physicians advised people to avoid certain foods, fish, fruit, or water from particular wells. Others suggested carrying jewels, precious metals, or even live animals against the skin, believing these could draw out poison. In Milan, one physician recommended killing stray dogs and cats, blaming them for the spread of Lee's true role. Remained invisible, and so remedies scattered wildly across theory and superstition. But it would be unfair to dismiss these physicians as merely ignorant. They worked with the knowledge available, applying logic as best they could. They observed carefully, they reasoned according to their frameworks, and they recorded what they saw. Their failures were not from negligence, but from the limits of medieval science. In a sense, their bird-beaked masks, whether literal or imagined, symbolize humanity's attempt to impose meaning on the incomprehensible. The psychological strain on physicians was immense. To watch patient after patient die, despite every effort, must have been shattering. Some withdrew, refusing to see new patients. Others continued with grim resignation, knowing they could offer a little more than presence. The role of physician became less about curing and more about witnessing, standing at the threshold of death, acknowledging suffering, recording its symptoms. Their pens preserved what their remedies could not alter. The legacy of these physicians is paradoxical. They did not cure the plague, yet they gave us some of the most detailed descriptions of its effects. They could not halt death, yet their attempts laid the groundwork for later generations of medicine. The bird-beaked mask, whether worn in the 14th century or imagined later, captures this paradox, an image of futility and determination, of ignorance and courage intertwined. As Section 1 closes, a question lingers. If physicians, armed with knowledge and determination, could do nothing but watch, what does that reveal about the limits of human understanding when faced with forces still unseen? Asterisk, as the plague continued its march across Europe, physicians found themselves at the center of both expectation and accusation. They were summoned by nobles, guild leaders, and townspeople desperate for answers. They were also blamed when their treatments failed, which was nearly always. In this sense, the Black Death exposed the limits not just of medical knowledge, but of society's faith in medicine itself. To understand their predicament, one must consider the intellectual world of a 14th century physician. Medicine was taught in universities such as Paris, Bologna, and Montpellier, where students studied Latin texts handed down from antiquity. Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and Aristotle formed the backbone of the curriculum. Physicians learned that the body was governed by humors, that health was balance, and that disease arose from imbalance or external corruption. They learned to interpret urine by its color and consistency, to feel pulses, and to read the body like a manuscript. Within this framework, the plague was not an infection, but an atmospheric corruption, a poisoning of the air itself. Thus, physicians prescribed remedies accordingly. Fires were lit in public squares to purify the air. Streets were sprinkled with vinegar. Cumed water was poured on floors. People were advised to avoid bathing, since open pores were thought to invite foul vapors. They were urged to eat moderately, avoid fruit, and drink only good wine. These instructions, copied into pamphlets and circulated, represented organized attempts to respond to the crisis. Yet none addressed the true mechanism, the bite of the flea. Even so, physicians continued to treat patients individually. Bleeding remained common, designed to release excess humors. Cupping glasses were applied to draw out impurities. Poultices of onions, herbs, or even ground emeralds were spread over buboes. In some cases, the swellings were lanced, with physicians hoping to release the poison inside. Survivors of such procedures were rare, though a few may have lived long enough to give the illusion of success. Remedies were remembered and repeated, even if their results were uncertain. The social role of physicians became complicated. On the one hand, they were honored for their learning, often seated among city leaders in councils to advise on policy. On the other hand, their powerlessness made them targets of frustration. In some towns, they were accused of incompetence or greed. Chroniclers wrote bitterly of physicians demanding high fees, then fleeing at the first sign of danger. Yet others recorded praise for those who remained, ministering to the sick despite knowing their efforts were futile. The plague magnified every aspect of the physician's role, both respect and resentment. It is here that the image of the bird-beaked mask, though anachronistic for the 14th century, becomes symbolically powerful. China in the 17th century. Physicians in plague-stricken cities like Venice and Paris adopted these costumes: long leather coats, gloves, boots, and the beaked mask stuffed with herbs. The beak was believed to filter the poisoned air, the leather to block miasma from entering the pores. Cain allowed the physician to examine patients without touching them directly. The outfit was terrifying to behold, yet it embodied the belief that death could be held at bay by barriers and scents, though not worn in 1348. This figure captures the essence of medieval medicine, the desperate attempt to find order in the face of invisible chaos. The daily work of physicians during the Black Death was exhausting. They rose to calls at all hours, summoned to homes where families lay fevered. They examined buboes by candlelight, prescribed diets, offered herbs, and whispered prayers. Sometimes they returned the next morning to find the entire household dead. The pattern repeated endlessly, wearing down body and spirit. Many physicians themselves succumbed. Courts note their deaths in the same lists as their patients. Knowledge did not grant immunity. In fact, their constant exposure made them especially vulnerable. The plague also forced physicians into moral dilemmas. Should they remain in cities to treat the sick, or flee to save themselves? Some chose the latter, retreating to countryside estates or monasteries. Others stayed, convinced that duty required it, or persuaded by high payments from desperate nobles. Boccaccio observed in Florence that many physicians vanished during the crisis, their absence leaving people to rely on apothecaries, quacks, or their own desperate remedies. Yet a few remained, and their presence, though ineffective, offered comfort to the dying. Even when cure was impossible, the simple act of attention mattered. The intellectual challenge was immense. Physicians tried to explain why some survived, while others perished. They noted patterns. The poor seemed more vulnerable, though the wealthy were not spared. Households fell together, yet sometimes a servant lived while the master died. These inconsistencies puzzled them. Theories multiplied: bad air, divine punishment, astral influence, corrupted water, even poisoned wells. None touched the reality of fleas feeding on rats, then leaping to humans. The true explanation lay beyond the reach of medieval observation. And yet, their writings are invaluable to us. Physicians recorded symptoms with careful detail, descriptions that still inform modern historians and epidemiologists. They left behind case notes, letters, and treatises attempting to make sense of the catastrophe. Though wrong in cause, they were often precise in observation. These records are among the clearest windows we have into the lived experience of plague. The symbolic role of the physician, however, changed permanently. Before the Black Death, physicians were figures of learning and authority. After it, they became symbols of limitation. Their inability to halt the plague exposed the boundaries of human knowledge. Yet paradoxically, this very failure fueled later advances. The recognition that traditional remedies failed encouraged new approaches in later centuries, paving the way for experiments, dissections, and eventually the birth of modern medicine. The bird-beaked mask may not have saved lives, but it represents a crucial stage in humanity's confrontation with disease, the effort to shield, serve, and survive in ignorance. As Section 2 closes, we are left with a haunting thought. If physicians, equipped with centuries of learning, could not protect themselves or their patients, what hope could ordinary people have in villages and cities where even knowledge offered no defense? Asterisk, by the end of the Black Death's first great wave, medicine in Europe was left altered, not by its triumph, but by its failure. Physicians had faced the most devastating epidemic in memory and had been unable to offer more than comfort in theory. Their remedies, bleeding, fumigation, herbs, charms, had done little. Their explanations, miasmas, planetary conjunctions, humoral imbalance, had reassured few. And yet, paradoxically, their work during the plague left an enduring legacy. One of the clearest legacies was their writing. Though their cures failed, physicians wrote carefully about what they saw. They described the speed of death, the swellings in the groin and armpit, the fevers and delirium. They distinguished between the bubonic form with its grotesque lumps and the pneumonic form, where victims coughed blood and died within hours. Their observations, preserved in chronicles and medical treatises, remain some of the most detailed accounts of the Black Death. Even in failure, they documented truth. Another legacy laid in the professional identity of physicians. Before the plague, medicine was often regarded as a learned but somewhat peripheral discipline, subordinate to theology and law. Afterward, medicine gained new urgency. Communities recognized, even in anger, that health was a matter of survival. Cities invested more in public health, cleaning streets, regulating markets, and eventually developing the practice of quarantine. The image of the physician, limited though it was, became central in these efforts. Their bird-beaked masks in later centuries symbolized not only protection, but civic duty, the willingness to stand amid death when others fled. But during the 14th century itself, the experience was one of humiliation. Physicians were mocked for their failures, accused of profiting from misery, and often abandoned by their own patients. Chroniclers record scornful remarks about their remedies, noting how little difference they made. Florence Boccaccio wrote that physicians could do nothing despite their numbers and their wisdom. In London, records show that plague spread through every parish regardless of medical presence. The helplessness of the learned class was laid bare. This humiliation, however, was instructive. The collapse of old explanations forced, in the long run, a shift in thinking. Though it would take centuries, the failure of humoral medicine during plague helped open the way for anatomical studies, dissections, and eventually microbiology. The bird-beaked mask, grotesque and futile, represents the beginning of this transformation. Acknowledgement that barriers and observation mattered, even if misunderstood. It was a first step, however clumsy, towards scientific method. The daily lives of plague physicians were marked by exhaustion and dread. Imagine a man rising each morning, summoned to houses where entire families lay ill. He examines swollen buboes, prescribes fumigation, lances swellings, writes notes, collects fees, then leaves only to hear days later that all his patients are dead. He repeats this routine until he, too, succumbs. Many did not live to write their accounts. Those who survived often did so by fleeing, abandoning their posts in shame or resignation. The reputation